Okay, so talked about the agricultural side of things. The other piece we need to address is industrialization. Both Russia and China wanted to create big industrialized economies. Industrialization was seen as the key to ending poverty in these countries. When the Chinese communists came to power in 1949, they tried to mimic what the Soviets had done in Russia in terms of industrialization, which was actually quite impressive. The Soviet Union's model of industrialization was respected by the Chinese because it ultimately created an army that was responsible for the defeat of the Nazis, or at least partly responsible for the defeat of the Nazis in World War II. And they created significantly more wealth in the Soviet Union than they'd ever known before in Russia. The Soviet Union was one of the world's two superpowers now. The model pioneered by the Soviets involved state ownership of private property and really state control of every aspect of the economy. It was about putting people to work in an extremely organized way. In both Russia and China, industrialization had similar outcomes. Some of the good things were it improved literacy, it led to the growth of cities, and it did promote or produce more wealth. Negatives led to damaging the countryside, a lot of environmental damage, taking resources from the countryside to manufacture things in the cities, and it led to the creation of elite classes that communism was supposed to be against. One of the big differences between industrialization in the Soviet Union and Russia is how the leaders of the communist parties, Stalin in the Soviet Union and Mao in China, responded to the emergence of these new elite classes. Stalin really accepted the new elite class, while Mao didn't. Mao was ardently communist, and his belief was that in communism, an elite class will continuously emerge. Elite classes was a natural process of industrialization, but he didn't believe that this was okay. By following the Soviet model, he believed that China was moving away from true communism. And one of Mao's most important ideas, and this idea goes to explain a lot of the really strange decisions that he makes, is the idea of permanent revolution. Permanent revolution is the idea that in a revolution towards communism, there will always be forces that will pull the revolution back and undo progress. So think of it as 2 steps towards communism, 1 step back. 2 steps towards communism, 1 step back. And that step back is the emergence of elite classes, emergence of wealthier people. So he really called for a permanent revolution against elite classes. Now, Mao was the leader of the Communist Party, but he called to have a constant revolution against the Communist Party to keep the members of the Communist Party on their toes and make sure that they didn't start acting elitist and forget what their communist roots were. So this idea of permanent revolution goes a long way in explaining one of Mao's biggest mistakes, which was the Great Leap Forward. And this took place between the years 1958 and 1960. Mao's concern was that communism would ultimately favor people in cities, workers in cities, over the countryside, and there wouldn't be equality. So what Mao decided needed to happen was industrialization in the countryside, and everybody would take part in industrial production and basically making these small factories in the countryside to produce industrial goods. Everybody should take part in industrial production as opposed to one elite group. The goal was to create these communes that produced their own food and industries, and this was a disaster, and it's what led to the famine that killed 20 million people between 1959 and 1962. So if Mao had died sometime around 1950, he probably would have gone down as one of the great heroes of the 20th century. He liberated China from Japanese fascists, he liberated China from foreign imperialists, but after the Great Leap Forward and the deaths of 20 million people, his legacy is obviously tarnished. But if he died after the Great Leap Forward, he'd probably still be regarded by a lot of people as a Chinese hero that made a really, really bad mistake. But before he died, he'd go on to make more massive mistakes, which makes assessing him a lot more difficult. And generally, the view from the West is that he was an evil man. He's generally regarded as a bad person. Still in China, many people regard him as a hero. So Mao's next mistake was also caused by this belief in permanent revolution, and that was essentially taking aim at his own party, the Communist Party. Mao saw that elitism was rampant in the upper ranks of the party, and these people were not living like communist equals, they were living better lives. So this was another attempt to get industrialization in the countryside started and to combat corruption. And this was known as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. So this was also about finding enemies within the Communist Party. Both the communist parties in the Soviet Union and China waged war against their own parties and their own citizens. In both states, there was only one party, but there were conflicts within this one party. In the Soviet Union, the search for enemies within the country happened in the years leading up to World War II, so the late 1930s. It was known as the Great Purges. During the purges, Stalin got rid of everybody in the Communist Party that he saw as being a threat to him, and this included all of Vladimir Lenin's, who's now dead, all of his friends, or the people that Lenin worked closely with. This also applied to just regular Soviet citizens that he thought were against the regime. In the late 1930s, Stalin's enemies were arrested in the middle of the night. A lot of them were given a quick trial, either sentenced to death or sentenced to a labor camp known as a gulag. A lot of these people were accused of having ties to the Nazi Party in Germany. This wasn't true, but it created an atmosphere of fear in the Soviet Union. Between the years 1936 and 1941, Stalin killed 1 million people and sent 5 million people to the gulags, or forced work camps. In the gulags, they worked in horrendous conditions, and many, many more died. In China, the search for enemies was the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution of 1966 and 1969. The difference between the Great Purges in the Soviet Union and the Cultural Revolution is that there was no central control for the Cultural Revolution in China. Mao became convinced that the Communist Party were abandoning communism and were becoming capitalists, so he called on young people in China to rise up. And millions of young Chinese men joined the revolution against the Communist Party. They created their own army called the Red Guards. They saw themselves as the guardians of communism and the revolution, and they violently attacked people that they thought were capitalists, and this included a lot of Communist Party members. They held massive rallies, they attacked factory owners, artists, intellectuals. The Cultural Revolution pushed China to the brink of civil war, and Mao eventually had to call in the Chinese military to put down the revolution that he started. But despite the fact that millions of people were dying during the Cultural Revolution, Mao thought it was a good thing because people needed to keep fighting to maintain the revolution.